The wind rolled like a restless spirit across the plains, stirring the golden grass and carrying the scent of dust and sun-baked earth. A lone woman stood in the midst of it all, her yellow dress catching the light like a fading flame against the barren horizon. In one hand, she clutched an old leather suitcase. In the other, only silence. Before her stood a house that looked as if it had been dead for decades, a skeleton of timber and broken glass. The porch sagged, the roof gaped open to the sky, and the wind moaned through the cracks, like it remembered every sorrow that had ever passed through those doors. She stared at it for a long moment, the weight of her journey pressing down on her shoulders. Before taking a slow step forward, she had come a long way from the eastern towns. From the crowded streets where people hurried past one another and never looked back. The train had carried her west until the tracks ran out, and then a stagecoach had taken her farther still, until even the driver had refused to go on. No one lives that far out anymore, he had warned, glancing at her through the dust-covered window. Not unless they're running from something. She hadn't answered. Maybe she was. The truth was, she didn't know if she was running toward something or away from it. All she knew was that this cabin, the one her late husband had spoken of in half-whispered stories before the fever, it took him, was all that remained of her hope. The land stretched endlessly around her, wide and wild, the way the old frontier always was. There were no fences, no neighbors, no sound of wagons or livestock. Only the sharp cry of a hawk circling above and the hum of wind brushing against her ears. Her boots sank into the sandy soil as she approached the porch, each step leaving a faint print that the wind quickly began to erase. The house loomed larger now, its timbers dark and splintered with age. She wondered if anyone had lived here since the last letter her husband wrote, the one that spoke of rebuilding and starting again, a dream he never got to finish. Her heart pounded as she reached the steps. They creaked under her weight, but they held. The air smelled of dry wood and forgotten memories. She could almost hear the echo of laughter that once filled these walls. See the faint shapes of people who had loved and lost within them. A cracked rocking chair swayed slightly on its own, moved by the wind. The sight sent a shiver up her spine. She wasn't sure if it was fear or sorrow, but she felt it deep. When she pushed open the door, it groaned in protest. Dust hung in the air like a curtain, glittering in the sunlight that slanted through the broken windows. The room beyond was bare except for an old table turned on its side, a shattered mirror, and the faint outline of a fireplace long gone cold. She stepped inside and set down her suitcase, her fingers brushing the edge of the mantel. There were faint marks on the wall scratches that might have been made by children or maybe by animals. It was hard to tell. The air was still, but something about it felt alive, as if the house itself was waiting to see if she would stay outside. A gust of wind rattled the loose boards and slammed the door shut behind her. The sound made her flinch. And for a heartbeat, she thought she saw movement in the corner of the room, a flicker of shadow, quick and silent. She froze, listening, but there was nothing. Only the wind again, sighing through the gaps. She told herself it was just her imagination, that old houses played tricks on the mind. Still, she kept her back to the wall until her breathing steadied. She unpacked slowly, laying out the few things she owned: a faded shawl, a folded letter tied with string, and a small framed photograph of a man in uniform. His eyes, kind yet burdened, stared back at her. "You said this place would be safe," she whispered, tracing the edge of the frame. Her voice sounded strange in the emptiness. "I hope you were right." That night the prairie sky stretched endless and black above her. Through the broken roof beams, she could see the stars, cold, clear, and countless. She built a small fire in the hearth, feeding it with pieces of fallen wood from the porch. The flames crackled softly, painting the walls in flickering light. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their cries lonely and haunting. She pulled her shawl tight and stared into the fire, trying to imagine what her husband saw in this place. Maybe it wasn't just a cabin to him. Maybe it was a promise, a second chance after all that had been lost in the war. But as the firelight faded, she heard it again, the sound of something moving upstairs. Slow, careful, deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the staircase, barely visible in the dark. The steps were old and half collapsed, but she could swear she heard the faint creak of a footstep. Then another. She gripped the iron poker from the hearth, her heart racing. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence answered. The wind outside rose suddenly, whistling through the cracks and shaking the shutters. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the sound stopped as quickly as it had come. She stood there for a long while, every muscle in her body tense, until the silence grew heavy again. Finally she exhaled and lowered the poker. Maybe it was an animal nesting up there, or maybe the old house just remembered too much. Either way, she decided she'd check in the morning. When dawn came, the light revealed more of the house's scars. There were claw marks on the inside of the doorframe, old stains on the floorboards. The back window was shattered inward, as though someone or something had tried to get inside. She stepped closer, feeling the dry wind on her face, and noticed the faintest trace of footprints in the dust. Not hers. Larger. Older. Her stomach turned cold. She backed away, glancing toward the stairs again. The upper floor was lost in shadow, but something about it seemed wrong now, as if it was watching her instead of the other way around. She forced herself to look away, to focus on the light spilling through the doorway. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and golden, so open it made her feel small. But in that openness, there was also a strange kind of peace. She stepped out onto the porch again, clutching her shawl against the wind. For the first time, she noticed the faint smoke rising from the far hills, too steady to be from wildfire. Someone was out there. Someone who shouldn't be. She stared at that distant smoke for a long while, her heart heavy with questions. Who else would live in a place so empty? And if they knew this house stood here, why hadn't they come? Or worse, had they already been here once before? The wind rose again, tugging at her hair and dress. She turned toward the horizon, her face pale but steady. Whatever waited beyond those hills or inside this broken home, she knew she couldn't turn back now. Behind her, in the quiet of the house, a floorboard creaked again. This time, she didn't imagine it. The morning light spread across the prairie, pale and cold, casting long shadows across the dry grass. She stood on the porch, her hands gripping the rail as she stared at the land stretching endlessly before her. The air was sharp with dust and sagebrush, and somewhere far off, a hawk cried out. The house behind her groaned with the wind, the sound like an old man sighing in his sleep. She turned slowly, her eyes tracing the broken roofline, the leaning porch posts, and the cracked window panes that caught the sunlight like shards of old glass. This place had once been someone's dream. Now it looked like it had been forgotten by the world. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and time. The floorboards creaked under her steps as she walked through each room, taking in what was left. A rusted lantern hung crooked by the door. The remains of a rocking chair sat near the hearth, one leg broken. Dust covered everything in a soft gray blanket. She could see where rain had leaked through the roof and left streaks on the walls. She found an old kettle lying by the stove, its handle bent but still whole. She picked it up and smiled faintly. It was something she could use. It felt good to touch something that still had a bit of purpose. The letter she carried in her suitcase had been written years ago, the ink faded and the paper yellowing at the edges. It was her husband's handwriting, firm but hurried, written when he still believed he'd come back for her. He had bought this land cheap, planning to build a new life away from the war and the noise of the towns. The soil's dry but kind, he had written. If a man works it right, it'll give him all he needs. Asked her to come once he finished the cabin. But before he could send for her, the fever took him. She had spent years after that working in a sewing shop, saving coins, holding on to the dream he had left behind. When she finally had enough, she packed what little she owned and made the journey west alone. And now, standing in the place he had once dreamed of, she wasn't sure if she had found something or lost everything all over again. She walked to the edge of the yard, the dry weeds brushing against her skirt. The sky seemed too wide, too empty. A place like this could swallow a person whole. Her husband had written that a small creek ran behind the house. But when she searched, she found only a shallow trench filled with cracked earth and a few animal tracks. She knelt, touching the dry soil, and wondered when it had last seen rain. As the sun climbed higher, she began to clean the inside of the house. She swept the floor, gathered what wood she could, and patched the cracks around the windows with old rags she tore from her underskirt. The work steadied her. It kept her from thinking too much about the sounds that came from upstairs, the slow, uneven creak that returned each time the wind died down. She told herself it was nothing but old boards shifting, though her stomach still tightened every time she heard it. When she climbed the stairs for the first time, her boots stirred clouds of dust. The steps moaned under her weight. She found 2 small rooms under the slanting roof, both nearly empty. In one corner, she discovered a child's wooden horse, broken at the leg, and beside it, a small blanket, thin and brittle with age. The sight of it made her chest ache. Someone had loved this place once. Someone had lived here, dreamed here, maybe even died here. She sat down on the edge of the old bed frame and felt the chill in the air. The window up here had no glass left, just open space staring out over the prairie. The wind blew through freely, carrying the scent of dust and loneliness. As she sat there, she thought she heard something faint, a whisper, or maybe a sigh, but when she looked around, there was nothing. Only the empty house breathing around her. That night, she lit a single candle and read her husband's letter again. Her eyes followed the familiar lines, though she could almost hear his voice speaking the words. "If you ever find this place, know that I built it for you. Even if I am gone, I want you to have something of mine that the world can't take." She closed her eyes, holding the paper to her chest. "I'm here," she whispered. "I came." The flame flickered as if stirred by a breath of air, though the window was shut tight. The sound came again, the creak from above, followed by the faint scrape of something against wood. Her pulse quickened. She rose slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for the iron poker near the hearth. The sound didn't come again, but the silence that followed felt alive. It's thick enough to make her skin prickle. When dawn came again, she found tracks outside near the porch. Not boot prints, bare feet, small and uneven, pressed lightly into the dust. They led around the corner of the house and disappeared near the dry creek bed. She crouched beside them, her breath short. Maybe someone had passed through, a wanderer or a lost soul. But the size of the prints made her pause. They looked like a child's. The wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of something distant, a voice, maybe, or the sound of laughter carried on the air. She straightened, her eyes sweeping the horizon. Nothing moved. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. She turned back toward the house, suddenly aware of how small and alone she truly was by midday. She decided to walk toward the hills, the ones where she'd seen smoke the day before. Maybe there were settlers nearby. Maybe she wasn't as isolated as it seemed. She packed a small bag, filled her canteen with what little water she had left, and started walking. The land stretched out in endless waves of gold and brown, the air shimmering with heat. Every few miles, she stopped to rest, shading her eyes and scanning the distance. Once, she thought she saw a movement of figure far off, watching her from a ridge. But when she blinked, it was gone. After hours of walking, she found the remains of an old campfire among the rocks. The ashes were cold, but not ancient. There were prints here, 2 larger ones this time, clear in the dirt. Someone had been here not long ago. She felt the weight of it pressing on her chest. Maybe she wasn't alone out here after all. But that didn't mean she was safe. She hurried back before sunset, her steps quickening as the light faded. The prairie at night was a different world. Shadows stretched long, and every sound seemed to echo louder than it should. When she reached the cabin, the wind was already rising, carrying the smell of rain. The sky had darkened to a deep gray, and thunder rolled faintly in the distance. She bolted the door and set the lantern by the window. The storm came suddenly, rain slashing against the roof, lightning flashing through the cracks. The thunder rattled the walls, and for a while, it drowned out all other sounds. But then, in the brief quiet between strikes, she heard it again, the slow creak above her, followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lantern and climbed the stairs. The wind howled outside, shaking the boards, but the noise upstairs was steady, patient, almost deliberate. She reached the landing, holding the lantern high. The light spilled across the narrow hallway, flickering against the peeling walls. She saw the old blanket again in the corner. Beside it, the faint shape of a footprint. Pressed into the dust, the lantern flame fluttered as if something had passed by. She felt the air shift, cold and heavy, and then everything went still. For a long moment, she couldn't move. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her fingers clutching the handle tight. Then, from somewhere deeper in the shadows, she thought she heard a whisper, small and distant. She backed away slowly, her heart thudding hard enough to drown out the storm. When she reached the stairs, she turned and nearly stumbled in her hurry to get down. The wind slammed against the walls, and the door below creaked open just an inch. Though she had locked it, she dropped the lantern near the hearth, where its light wavered wildly. Rain blew in through the cracks, and she pressed her back to the wall, her mind racing. Somewhere beyond the thunder, she thought she heard the faint sound of a child laughing. It was light and fleeting, like an echo caught in the wind. She sank to her knees, gripping the floorboards, her thoughts spinning between fear and disbelief. Whatever was in this house, it wasn't finished with her yet. Outside, the storm roared on, but inside, the air stayed still, waiting, watching, listening. The storm blew itself out before dawn, leaving the prairie washed and quiet. She stepped outside into the cool air and smelled wet dirt, sage, and the faint sweetness of creosote. The house looked different after the rain, darker at the edges, its broken bones glistening where the drops still clung. She followed the shallow run of the dry creek and found a ribbon of water moving lazily toward the flats. It was not much, but it was proof that the land still remembered how to live. She cupped her hands and drank, then filled her canteen and turned back toward the cabin. As she walked, she thought about the tracks she had seen, the childlike prints near the porch, the larger ones by the distant fire ring. People were out here. The thought both steadied her and unsettled her. A lone woman with a suitcase and a letter was not strong enough to bend the frontier. She had to learn it and move with it, the way her late husband had described in his letters. Inside, she made a small meal with the last of her biscuits and a strip of dried meat. The work of chewing calmed her. She stoked the morning fire and looked at the clock that hung crooked on the wall. It no longer kept time, but she watched the lifeless hands anyway, as if they might tell her when to be brave. She needed to understand the house and the land, and she needed to decide whether to stay. The house did not feel empty. It felt occupied by memory, and maybe more than memory. She set the photograph of her husband on the mantel and spoke to him the way she had done through the long train rides. She told him about the storm, the voices in the wind, the prints in the dust. Saying it aloud helped her hear the shape of the problem. The main conflict was not just survival in a lonely place. It was the question of what had happened here and who still claimed it. She started with the barn ruins past the scrub, half a wall standing and the rest fallen. Among the wreckage, she found a bit of rope, a few bent nails, and an iron brand shaped like a hooked star. The brand had a story. A brand is a promise on hot iron. Someone had run cattle here, claimed calves, and traded beef for coin. There must have been neighbors, ranch hands, maybe riders from the army passing through, maybe a traveling preacher. She set the brand aside and kicked at a mat of debris, uncovering a small wooden cross that had fallen face down in the dirt. There were no words carved into it. She placed it upright against the barn post, and the simple act filled her with a hush that felt like respect. It also filled her with questions. If a child had lived here, where had they gone? If someone had died who had marked the spot and who had left in such a hurry when the afternoon heat gathered? She carried a pail to the creek bed and returned with enough water to scrub the floor of the front room. As the dust lifted, faint markings appeared near the hearth. Not scratches this time, but chalk lines, the kind a child might draw when playing at lessons. She traced them with a finger and felt a sudden prick at the back of her neck, as if someone stood over her shoulder. Without turning, she said, as calmly as she could, that she meant no harm. The feeling eased, but it did not vanish. She set the iron brand under the table and opened the door to let the breeze push out the wet dust smell. The prairie light fell across the chalk lines, and for a heartbeat they looked fresh. By evening, she could not ignore the hills any longer. She had to know who camped out there, who watched her from the ridgeline. She saddled nothing because she had no horse. Instead, she wrapped bread in a cloth, took her canteen, and started out on foot. The angle of the sun scraped long shadows across the grass. She kept to the low ground and listened. Twice she heard a bird call that did not sound like a bird, the way men sometimes use a whistle to signal. She stopped and waited and kept her hands visible. On a gentle rise she found a cairn of stones, and beside it a coil of rope so new that the fibers still had their sheen. She crouched and spoke a greeting to the air. A movement answered her from the mesquite, slow and careful, and a figure stepped out with both hands raised. He was middle-aged, sun-dark, and thin like the land had been feeding him with a straight face. His boots were good, his hat better, and his shirt patched by a neat hand. He stood at a distance where both of them could run if they needed. She told him her name without offering more and asked if he knew the house by the dry creek. He said he did, and that folks around here called it the widow's place, though no one could agree whose widow it meant. He had a small homestead 3 miles west, he said, where he ran a few head and trapped when the price of pelts made sense. He had seen her arrive and kept watch to make sure traders or drifters did not trouble her. Then he asked whether she had heard anything unusual at night. She chose her words with care. She said she had heard steps and whispers and seen childlike tracks. He nodded in a way that meant the story fit inside a tale he already knew. He said that some years back a family tried to hold the place against a bad run of seasons. The father took work driving cattle south and came back late. The mother kept house and taught her child letters on the hearth bricks. He stopped there and looked over her shoulder at the open land. When she asked what happened next, he said he did not tell stories that belonged to other people. He did say that he had seen smoke near her house that did not come from her fire. That meant others were walking those nights too. When she asked who, he lifted a shoulder and said riders from the open range. Men who drifted between ranches and spoke little about their reasons. He told her not to trust a soft hat that looked hard, or a hard hat that smiled soft. On her way back, she found a charm hanging from a cottonwood, a little wheel made of willow with a feather tied to it. It spun lazily in the evening breeze. She had seen such things in railroad towns, where traders laid out baskets, beads, and tools. She left it as it was, feeling watched by a quiet that was not unfriendly. Back at the house, she lit a lantern and sat at the table with the iron brand. The willow charm in her thoughts and the chalk lines under her feet. The frontier did not hand out single answers. It layered them. Law and custom. Old tracks and new prints. The past standing up in the present like a person in a doorway. That night, the sound returned, not shy this time. It came from the back room, a light patter followed by a careful drag. She stood and spoke toward the dark, telling the empty air that she was tired of fear and would rather meet trouble face to face. The patter paused, then crossed the floor toward the hall. She saw nothing and felt a thread of cool air touch her wrist. The lantern flame leaned as if something breathed. A smell rose then, not dust, not damp wood, but something like sun-warmed milk. The kind of smell that clings to a child's blanket after a nap. She pressed her hand flat to the table to keep it from shaking, and told the air that the drawing on the hearth was neat work. The feeling in the room softened, and the lantern straightened. She did not sleep for a long time afterward, but she did not flee. When dawn broke, the chalk marks were clearer than the night before, as if a small hand had gone over them again. Days set into a rhythm. She worked the creek for every trickle, patched the roof with scavenged boards, and walked the property line with a stick to test the ground. Each afternoon she left a small cup of water and a crust of bread on the hearth, and each morning the bread was gone and the cup was placed 2 bricks to the left. She tried moving the cup before bed to see if it was her own habit, but the cup always found those 2 bricks by sunrise. She kept her voice steady and kind when she was alone, because the house answered tone, if not words. In the evenings, she watched the hills. Once she saw 2 riders, distant and lean, cutting across the flats with their eyes turned toward the sky, not toward her. Another time, she found a fresh boot print near the back door, the heel worn down to a slant. She measured her own boot against it and saw it belonged to a larger foot and a longer stride. The homesteader from the west came twice, each time calling from a respectful distance before he approached. He brought coffee and a coil of wire and asked her to tell him if strangers pressed too close. He said some men were looking for a boy who ran from a ranch north of here. The boy had been taken in after a sickness swept through a camp and left him without kin. He was small, fast, and quiet, and he had a way of leaving only half a track. She asked how small. He held out a hand, palm down, to a height that matched the memory of the chalk lines. She felt heat rise behind her eyes but did not let it fall. The man did not ask to look inside her house. He did not talk about spirits or signs. He only warned that men who searched for strays sometimes got rough, and rough men did not care about the polite line. Between one homestead and the next, at night the house kept shaping its replies. A chair she left by the window would be turned slightly toward the hearth. A shawl draped over the rocker would rest across the little bed frame upstairs by morning. The iron brand, heavy and awkward, shifted an inch toward the doorway one night and another inch the next. As if someone with small strength were dragging it with great focus, she began to speak to the house as if it were a person with its own burdens. She told it about the sewing shop back east, about the women who worked there and traded news over needles and thread. She told it how she used to stand in the doorway at dusk and watch street lamps ignite like tiny campfires. She told it how quiet the bed had been after her husband died. The room felt warmer when she spoke like that, as if the place approved of honesty. The riders came near at last. She heard them before she saw them, the steady rhythm of hooves on dry ground, the jingle of tackle. She stepped onto the porch with her hands visible and her back straight. 3 men rode up and stopped outside the yard. Their hats were low and their faces were shadowed, but their eyes were quick. They spoke easily at first, asking after water, asking whether she had seen anyone small and quiet pass through. She kept her answers plain. She had seen tracks of all sizes, and could not say which belonged to the person they wanted. The tallest rider smiled without softness and asked to look around. She told him the house was not open to callers. He said the range was wide and the law even wider. Sometimes a man's good sense needed to step outside his door and let business be business. She did not argue law or range. She told them she had a neighbor 3 miles west who always stopped by at sundown and liked to share news over coffee. The tall rider's smile tightened. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, nodded once, and led the others away. They did not go far. That night she saw a small fire on the ridge beyond the cottonwood, steady and low, the kind men build when they want to be near and unseen. She closed the door and set the bar, then sat by the hearth and moved the cup to bricks to the left in advance, in case a small hand forgot to do it. She whispered that the riders were near, that they wanted a boy who did not want them, and that she would do what she could to keep the house still. Toward midnight the air shifted again, cooler and focused, and she felt a weight on the chair beside her, an indentation where no body sat. She kept her eyes on the fire and said she would make more coffee if the house liked, and she would tell a story about a child who learned letters on a hearth and made every line straight no matter how rough the chalk. The chair creaked once in a sound that was almost content. Then a soft step came from the back room and another from the stairs, and the iron brand whispered across the floor, dragging a patient arc toward the door. She stood and set her hand on the cool iron and whispered that they were not going to open that door. Not tonight. The brand stilled. The cup sat to Brick's left. Outside, a horse snorted, and a rider shifted in his saddle. Waiting for a sign that would not come, before dawn, a new sound threaded through the house. It was faint and careful, like someone testing a lullaby they had not sung in years. It drifted from the stairs and touched the chalk lines and moved toward the rocking chair where it settled into quiet. She stood with the poker by her side and felt the hair on her arms lift, not from fear, but from the weight of a story pressing close without yet telling itself. The horizon paled. The rider's fire winked out. The creek whispered a little as it slowly forgot the storm. She did not sleep. She did not open the door. She waited with the brand at her feet and the photograph on the mantel and the cup, 2 bricks to the left. listening to the house breathe and to the prairie hold its breath, knowing the day would bring visitors again and that the choice she had not yet named was walking toward her across the flats. The next morning, the air felt heavy, as if the land itself was waiting for something to happen. The sky was streaked with long bands of gray, and a strange silence had fallen over the plains. Even the birds had gone quiet. She stood at the porch, the cool breeze tugging at her hair, and looked toward the distant ridge where the riders had camped the night before. The fire was gone now, replaced by the faint curl of smoke that rose and faded with the wind. They were still there, somewhere beyond sight, waiting for a reason to come closer. She could feel it in her bones that something was coming to a head. The boy, whoever he was part of it. She hadn't seen him yet, but she felt his presence like the faint hum of a thought that wouldn't fade. The little things the house did, the moved cup, the chalk marks, the creak of the stair at night had grown more deliberate, more alive. She had begun to sense purpose in them. It wasn't just haunting anymore. It was warning. She spent that morning working quietly, her eyes darting to the horizon every few minutes. She stacked wood by the hearth, filled the kettle, and checked the back door latch twice. Then, as she swept near the window, she caught sight of something moving along the creek, a small shape darting between the mesquite. Too small for a man, too quick for a deer. Her breath caught. She set down the broom and stepped outside, her boots crunching softly on the damp ground. "Hey there," she called gently. "You don't have to hide." No answer. Only the faint rustle of grass. She moved slowly, keeping her hands open at her sides. "It's all right. I'm alone here." A figure stepped out from behind a bush, a boy, thin as a reed, his face streaked with dirt and fear. His clothes were torn, his eyes wide and wild like an animal that had been chased too long. He didn't move, only stared at her, muscles tense and ready to bolt. She took another careful step. "You've been out here for days, haven't you?" He didn't answer. "I have food inside," she said softly, "and water." His eyes flicked toward the house, then back to her. "They'll find me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew. "The men with the horses?" He started to step back, but she raised her hand quickly. "I won't tell them. You're safe here." For a long moment, he stood frozen, torn between flight and hope. Then slowly, he took a step forward. By the time they reached the porch, she could see how young he really was, no more than 12. His face hollow from hunger, his hands trembling. Inside, she gave him bread and water, watching him eat in silence. He didn't look up until his hunger eased a little. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "Luke." "Where are you from, Luke?" He swallowed hard. "Nowhere that matters." She didn't push him. After a while, he spoke again. "They said I belonged to them. But I didn't. I ran when they started hurting the horses. I couldn't stand it." Her heart clenched. "You did the right thing leaving." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with something between fear and disbelief. "They'll kill me if they find me." Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, though the sky held no clouds. It was the kind of sound that came from far away, maybe from the canyons beyond the ridge, or maybe from the weight of the moment itself. She made him a small bed in the back room, the one with the chalk marks and the broken window. The boy hesitated at the doorway. "There's something in here," he whispered. "I know," she said. "It won't hurt you." That night, the wind returned, carrying a strange calm with it. She couldn't sleep. She sat by the hearth, listening to the fire crackle, while upstairs the boards creaked softly under unseen feet. She wasn't afraid anymore. The house had chosen its side. Near midnight, the boy appeared in the doorway, pale and wide-eyed. "They're out there," he whispered. "I saw their campfire." She went to the window. Far across the prairie, 3 small points of light burned low, steady, and close. The riders hadn't left. They had moved closer. She turned to the boy. "We'll need to be ready at dawn." The night dragged on, thick with waiting. The air outside grew colder, and the horses' faint whinnies carried through the dark. She could almost feel their breath in the wind. The boy stayed close to the hearth, his knees drawn up to his chest. While she gathered what she had, an old rifle, half rusted but loaded, and a hatchet she used for wood. The sound from upstairs came again, but this time it was different, measured, calm, as though someone was pacing with intent. In the gray light before dawn, she stepped outside. The land was still, the horizon washed in the pale glow of morning. She saw movement among the mesquite glint of metal, the ripple of a coat. The riders were coming. She went back inside and touched the boy's shoulder. "You have to stay quiet, no matter what happens." He nodded, his small hands gripping the edge of the chair. The first rider appeared just as the sun broke over the hills. He rode slowly, his horse kicking up plumes of dust. The other two followed, their faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. They stopped a few yards from the porch, just like before. "Mornin', ma'am," the tallest said. His voice was smooth but cold. "We're looking for a runaway." "Young boy. Might have come this way?" She stood in the doorway, steady but calm. "I haven't seen anyone." He tilted his head. "Mind if we take a look around?" "Just to be sure." "This is my home," she said firmly. "No one comes inside without my say." The man smiled faintly. "You're brave for a woman out here alone." "I'm not alone," she said quietly. For a heartbeat, he seemed to study her face. Then his eyes flicked past her shoulder toward the dark doorway behind. "You sure about that?" Before she could answer, a noise came from inside the creak of the floorboards upstairs. His hand went to his gun. "What was that?" "The house settles when the wind changes," she said, her tone steady. "Been doing that since before you were born." He dismounted, boots hitting the dirt. "Funny thing," he said, walking closer. "This place was built by a man who died out here with his wife and kid. Folks say the land never forgot." "I guess you'll find out if that's true," she replied. Her eyes not leaving his, he took another step, and the front door swung open wider, though she hadn't touched it. A cold gust blew through, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter, childlike, distant, echoing down from the stairs. The man froze. The other riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. "What in?" he started, but the sound came again, clearer this time. The boy's chalk lines on the hearth glowed faintly in the dim light, and the air in the room grew heavy, thick with unseen presence. The man's hand dropped from his gun. "Let's go," one of the others muttered, spitting into the dirt. "Ain't worth it." But the leader didn't move. He stared into the dark hallway, his jaw tight. "If he's here, I'll find him," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Behind her, she heard the soft scrape of metal, the iron brand moving across the floor on its own. The sound made the horses snort and back up, their eyes wide. She took a step forward, her voice calm but firm. "You need to leave this land. It doesn't belong to you." He looked at her, his face pale now. "What are you?" "Just someone who keeps promises," she said. The brand clanged against the threshold, and the sound rolled across the yard like thunder. The wind rose sharply, swirling dust around the riders. The horses reared, fighting the reins, and the men struggled to stay mounted. "Go," she said louder this time. "Before the land remembers your names." The leader spat, cursed, and yanked his horse around. Within moments they were galloping toward the hills, their silhouettes shrinking into the rising sun. When the last of them disappeared, she turned back to the house. The wind had gone still. The air felt lighter, clearer. The brand lay across the doorway, the metal faintly warm to the touch. The boy stepped out from the shadows, his eyes wide with wonder and fear. "What was that?" he whispered. She looked down at him, her voice soft. "Something that protects what's still good." He nodded slowly, glancing toward the stairs. "They won't come back, will they? Not if the house has anything to say about it." They sat together by the hearth, waiting for the light to fully fill the room. Outside, the land glowed gold under the morning sun, washed clean by the storm that never came. But inside, the air still hummed faintly, alive with something that had been here long before either of them. And though she didn't know what the next day would bring, she knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over yet, but the house, the land, and whatever spirit guarded it, had finally chosen to stand beside her. The prairie was no longer silent. It was awake, waiting for what would come next. The sun climbed slowly over the wide prairie, turning the grass a soft gold. The long night was over, and the stillness that settled around the cabin felt different, now peaceful instead of fearful. She stepped outside, the boards of the porch warm under her feet, and watched the horizon breathe light into the land. The air smelled clean, carrying the faint sweetness of rain that had passed far away. It felt like the world had turned a page. The house behind her no longer creaked the same way. It was quieter, as if it too had found rest. The boy came out a few moments later, rubbing his eyes and squinting against the light. His clothes were too big for him, but his face looked softer now, not haunted like before. "They've really gone?" he asked. She nodded. "They won't be back." The land made sure of that. Stood beside her, staring at the open plains. "Then what do we do now?" She smiled faintly. "Now we live." It took days to mend what the storm and the years had broken. Together, they cleaned the cabin from top to bottom. The boy helped carry buckets of water from the creek, laughing when he slipped in the mud. She patched the roof while he swept the floors. The sound of his voice filled the rooms where silence used to live. Sometimes she caught herself listening for the faint laugh that once haunted the halls. But it no longer came as a warning, it came like a memory, kind and distant, as though whoever lingered here had finally found peace. One evening, when the wind was gentle and the light turned everything bronze, she found him sitting by the hearth with a piece of chalk in his hand. He was tracing the old lines again, his face calm. "Do you know who drew those first?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, ma'am." "A mother and her child," she said softly. "They lived here before us. Life was hard and they didn't make it through the winter. But their love for this place stayed. Maybe that's what you felt here. Not ghosts, just love that never left." He looked at the lines again, then at her. "Do you think they were watching us?" "I think they still are," she said, smiling. "And I think they're proud we stayed." The boy's eyes brightened with something like hope. "I could keep drawing for them," he said. "That would be nice," she replied. They liked good company. As weeks passed, the land itself began to change. The dry creek carried more water after a short rain, and wildflowers started to appear near the fence posts. Birds came back to the trees, nesting where the branches still held firm. The cabin began to feel like a home again, not just a shelter. The boy found an old harmonica in a chest, and though the notes were rough at first, he learned to play soft tunes by the fire at night. She would listen while she mended clothes or watched the flames dance, her thoughts filled with quiet gratitude. Sometimes, she'd talk to her husband's photograph on the mantel, telling him how far she'd come. "You were right," she would say. "The soil's dry, but it's kind. If you treat it with care, it gives back." One morning, the man from the west rode over again. He tied his horse near the fence and greeted them both with a nod. His eyes took in the fresh smoke from the chimney and the green shoots near the door. "Looks like the place is breathing again," he said. She smiled. "It's got help now." The man looked at the boy. "So I see. He's strong. He'll do right by this land if you teach him." "I intend to," she said. He tipped his hat. "Those riders won't trouble you again? Word spreads fast out here. Nobody crosses a homestead the prairie's taken under its wing." She thanked him, and he left before noon, disappearing into the endless light. The boy watched him go, and then turned to her. "You think I could learn to ride like that one day?" "With time," she said. "But first, we need to build a barn." It took all summer to do it. They worked side by side from dawn to dusk, hammering, sawing, and setting posts until the new barn stood where the old one had fallen. Every piece of wood felt like a step towards something better. When it was done, they stood back and admired their work. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. By autumn, the fields around the cabin had begun to show signs of life again. The boy learned to plant, to mend fences, to listen to the weather. He laughed more, spoke more, and began to lose the wary look that had followed him when he arrived. He told her once that he used to dream of running until he disappeared. Now he said he dreamed of staying in the evenings. When the sun dipped low and the world turned amber, they would sit on the porch together. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. The prairie didn't need words. It had its own language. The rustle of grass, The hum of crickets, the soft whisper of the wind were enough. As winter approached, she found herself thinking about how far things had come since the day she first saw this cabin broken, hollow and forgotten. She remembered stepping through the door and feeling the weight of loss. Now she felt warmth instead. The land had healed, and so had she, the night before the first snow. She woke to a sound that didn't startle her this time, the faint laughter of a child upstairs, followed by a woman's voice, soft and loving like a lullaby. It wasn't frightening. It was gentle, like the house saying goodnight. She smiled in the dark, whispering her thanks. When morning came, the world was covered in white. The boy ran outside, laughing as he kicked through the snow, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. She watched from the porch, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt no fear, no emptiness, only belonging. The boy called out to her, his cheeks red and his eyes bright. "Come on." The snow's deep enough to leave tracks. She laughed softly and stepped down into the drift. Together, they crossed the yard, their footprints side by side, leading toward the horizon as they walked. She looked back once at the cabin, the smoke rising from the chimney. The door opened just a crack, the faint shimmer of light inside. She knew she would never be alone again. Whatever had once haunted this place had turned into something else entirely, a guardian. A memory, a promise kept. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the boy leaned against her shoulder. "You think we can make it through another winter?" She smiled, resting a hand on his hair. "We already did. The hardest part's behind us." He nodded sleepily. "It feels like home now." "Is home," she said. Outside, the prairie wind sang softly against the windows, carrying the scent of snow and pine. The iron brand still lay by the door, but it no longer felt like a weapon. It was a symbol now, a reminder of the past and the strength that had risen from it. The cup still sat 2 bricks to the left on the hearth, untouched but waiting. A quiet sign that kindness was always noticed in this house. As the firelight flickered, she closed her eyes and thought of her husband, of the family who once lived here. Of all the souls who had ever dreamed beneath this roof. "You can rest now," she whispered. "We'll take care of it from here." The flames crackled softly in reply, and she felt something warm move through the room, like the air itself smiling. The snow kept falling through the night, wrapping the land in silence. By morning, the world outside shimmered beneath the pale winter sun, endless and full of promise. She and the boy stepped out onto the porch again, their breath white in the cold, and looked across the wide prairie that stretched far beyond sight, for the first time since she arrived. She didn't feel like a visitor. She felt like part of the land, part of the story that would live on here long after they were gone. The old cabin stood firm, strong against the wind, carrying within its walls the laughter of the living, the peace of the past. She took the boy's hand and smiled at the horizon. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's see what the new day brings." Together they walked into the sunlight, leaving behind the house that had once been haunted, now alive with hope and belonging. The prairie wind carried their laughter far, mixing it with the rustle of golden grass and the whisper of an old promise finally kept. The land was quiet again, but this time it was the kind of quiet that meant peace.